It felt like the world had stopped. The sterile white walls of the hospital room seemed to close in on me as I stood frozen, my breath caught in my throat. The man lying in the bed, the man I had loved, who had whispered promises of forever into my ear, looked at me with the blankest expression I had ever seen. His eyes, once warm and familiar, now carried a hollow detachment. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice tinged with confusion and a trace of fear. 2 words, yet they shattered my entire being. My lips moved, but no sound came out. My mind screamed 1,000 responses, none of which made it past the lump in my throat. I'm Mia," I managed to whisper, my voice trembling. "I'm your fiancé." His brows furrowed, his head tilting slightly as though trying to grasp something just out of reach. "Fiancé?" he repeated, the words sounding foreign on his tongue. I don't remember you." A cold, numbing sensation spread through my chest. This couldn't be real. This had to be some sort of nightmare, a cruel twist of fate that I would wake up from any second now. But the longer I stood there, the more the reality of the situation pressed down on me. The doctor's voice broke through the fog in my mind. "Miss, we've observed no physical damage to his brain. This kind of memory loss is unusual, extremely rare in cases like his." "So why doesn't he remember me?" I snapped, the desperation in my voice surprising even myself. My hands were trembling now, and I clenched them into fists to steady myself. The doctor hesitated, glancing between me and the man in the bed. "It's difficult to say. Memory loss can sometimes be psychological, triggered by trauma. With time, his memories may return, but..." "But?" I pressed. He sighed. "There's no guarantee." I turned back to him, to Liam. He looked so vulnerable lying there, his arm in a sling, a bandage wrapped around his forehead. The sight of him like this should have filled me with nothing but concern and love. But the way he looked at me, like I was a stranger, it felt like a knife twisting in my chest. "Liam," I said softly, stepping closer. "It's me. We've been together for 5 years. We're supposed to get married in 2 months." His expression didn't change. He just stared at me, his eyes searching mine as though trying to find some spark of recognition. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice heavy with regret. I wish I could remember, but I don't." A tear slipped down my cheek, and I quickly wiped it away. This wasn't about me. He needed me to be strong right now. He needed me to help him through this, even if it meant enduring the heartbreak of being a stranger to the man I loved. "It's okay," I lied, forcing a small smile. "We'll figure this out, together." His lips quirked up in a faint smile, and for a moment I caught a glimpse of the Liam I knew. But just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by that same empty confusion. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of hospital visits and endless conversations with doctors. They ran test after test, but the results were always the same: no physical reason for his memory loss. Every time I visited, I would bring photos, recount stories of our life together, anything to spark his memory. And every time, he would listen politely, his face a mask of polite interest, but there was never a flicker of recognition. It was as though the life we had built together had been wiped clean, leaving me clinging to the fragments while he stood on the other side of an impenetrable wall. One afternoon, as I sat by his bedside, showing him pictures from our last vacation, he spoke up. "You don't have to keep doing this, you know." I looked up, startled. "Doing what?" "Trying so hard," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I appreciate it, I really do. But maybe it's better if you just move on. I don't want to hold you back." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Move on? How could he say that? How could he ask me to give up on him, on us? "I'm not giving up on you," I said firmly, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "I love you, Liam, and I'm not going anywhere." He didn't respond, his gaze dropping to his hands. The silence between us was heavy, filled with unspoken words and emotions neither of us knew how to express. As I left the hospital that evening, the doctor caught me in the hallway. "Miss, may I have a word?" I nodded, following him into a small office. He closed the door behind us, his expression serious. "I've been reviewing Liam's case, and there's something unusual about his condition." "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart pounding. "There are inconsistencies," he said carefully. "I can't go into detail without breaching patient confidentiality, but I would advise you to be cautious." "Cautious?" I repeated, frowning. "What are you trying to say?" He hesitated, as though weighing his words. "Just trust your instincts," he said finally. As I walked out of the hospital, his words echoed in my mind. Trust your instincts. I didn't know what he meant, but a gnawing sense of unease began to take root in my chest. Something wasn't right, and I was going to find out what. I remember the first time I saw Liam. It was a late autumn afternoon, and the air was filled with the crisp scent of fallen leaves. I had just moved to the city, a small-town girl trying to find her way in a world that felt too big and too fast. The coffee shop where I worked was bustling that day, a haven for people seeking warmth and caffeine against the cold. He walked in, tall and confident, with a slight smirk that somehow didn't feel arrogant. He ordered a black coffee, no sugar, no cream, simple and straightforward, just like the way he introduced himself. "You look like you've had a long day," he said, handing me the exact change with a $20 bill tucked underneath. I blinked, confused, until I noticed the small note scrawled on the edge. "Let me buy you dinner sometime? Call me." Beneath the words was his number. I couldn't help but laugh. It was bold, almost too bold, but something about him disarmed me. That night, I stared at the number scribbled on a napkin for hours before deciding to call. Our first date was magical, though not in the traditional sense. He took me to a dingy little diner on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place where the vinyl seats stick to your legs, and the menu hasn't changed in decades. But he made it special. We talked for hours about everything and nothing, our favorite books, our wildest dreams, the stupid things we did as kids. He listened, really listened, as if every word I said mattered. That was Liam. He had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the world who mattered. It wasn't just charm, it was genuine. He saw people, really saw them, and he made me feel seen in a way I never had before. From that night on, we were inseparable. Our love grew in the quiet, ordinary moments, cooking dinner together in my tiny apartment, dancing in the living room to old records, or watching thunderstorms from the safety of his balcony. He was my rock, my safe place in a world that often felt overwhelming. I still remember the day he proposed. It was during a trip to the mountains, one of those spontaneous adventures he loved to plan. We had hiked for hours, and I was exhausted, my boots covered in mud, my hair a tangled mess. As we reached the summit, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I turned to him, ready to complain about how much my feet hurt, only to find him kneeling on the rocky ground, a small velvet box in his hand. "I know life isn't perfect," he began, his voice steady despite the wind whipping around us. "But with you, it feels damn close. Marry me, Mia. Let's build something messy and beautiful together." I said yes before he even finished speaking. In that moment, I felt like I had everything I'd ever dreamed of. A love so pure and steadfast, it seemed unshakable. But as I sat in the hospital, staring at the man who now claimed to have no memory of me, those once vivid memories felt like a cruel trick. How could the same man who had held my hand and vowed to never let go now look at me with such emptiness? How could he forget the years we spent building a life together? I clung to the hope that this was temporary, that he would wake up one day and everything would come rushing back. But deep down, a small, nagging voice whispered that something was wrong, that the cracks in our perfect love story might have been there all along, hidden beneath the surface. At first, I didn't notice the cracks. Or maybe I did, but I chose to ignore them, brushing them off as quirks or harmless habits. It's easy to do that when you're in love. Convince yourself that no one is perfect, that love is about compromise. And so, I compromised. It started with little things. Dishes left in the sink after I'd cooked dinner. Socks strewn across the floor, even when the laundry basket was just a few feet away. His razor, always left on the edge of the sink, dripping water onto the counter. Small annoyances, really, the kind you expect when two people move in together and begin to share a life. But over time, those little things began to pile up, like a weight pressing down on me. No matter how many times I asked, he wouldn't change. "I'll get to it later," he'd say with a smile, as if his charm could erase the frustration building inside me. Later never came, though. It was always me who ended up scrubbing the pots and pans, folding the laundry, taking out the trash. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. He works hard, I'd think, and he's tired when he comes home. But so was I. I had my own job, my own stresses, yet the weight of maintaining our home always seemed to fall on my shoulders. I tried talking to him about it, gently at first, but the conversations always ended the same way. "Babe, you're overreacting," he'd say, brushing me off. "It's not like the house is falling apart." I started to feel like a nag, like the bad guy for wanting him to pull his weight. And every time I brought it up, I could see the irritation flash in his eyes, his easygoing demeanor hardening just enough to make me hesitate. So I stopped bringing it up. It wasn't worth the arguments, the tension that lingered long after the words had faded. Instead, I took on more. Cleaning, cooking, paying the bills on time. I became the manager of our little world, juggling everything while he floated above it all, carefree and oblivious. He wasn't mean or malicious about it. He just didn't seem to notice, or care, that I was drowning. Then there were the bigger things, the moments when his lack of responsibility felt less like a quirk and more like a red flag. Like the time our landlord called, furious because the rent hadn't been paid. I had given Liam the money weeks ago, trusting him to take care of it. But instead of paying the rent, he'd spent it on some new gadget he just had to have. "It was a mistake," he insisted, his tone defensive when I confronted him. "I'll fix it, okay? Why are you making such a big deal out of this?" It was a big deal, though. I had to scramble to cover the overdue rent, dipping into my savings while he shrugged it off like it was nothing. That night, as I sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the bank statement in front of me, I felt the first real pangs of doubt. Was this what my future would look like? Cleaning up his messes, both literal and figurative, while he carried on without a care? Still, I stayed. I told myself he'd grow up, that he'd learn to take more responsibility. He loved me, didn't he? And love meant patience, sacrifice. I convinced myself that things would get better, even as the weight of his carelessness continued to press down on me. The worst part was how good he was at making me forget. For every moment of frustration, there was a moment of sweetness, a grand gesture that swept me off my feet. He'd come home with flowers for no reason, or surprise me with tickets to a concert I'd mentioned in passing. And for a while, it worked. Those moments reminded me of why I fell in love with him in the first place, why I believed we could build a life together. But love, I realized, isn't just about the highs. It's about the in-betweens, the quiet, mundane moments that make up most of life. And in those moments, I was alone. The first real argument we had wasn't about the dishes or the laundry or even the rent. It was about a trip we had planned, a weekend getaway to the beach. I had spent weeks organizing everything, booking the hotel, planning the route, even packing his bag because I knew he wouldn't do it until the last minute. The morning we were supposed to leave, I woke up to find him still asleep, his things scattered across the floor. "Liam," I said, shaking him awake, "we have to go." He groaned, pulling the blanket over his head. 5 more minutes. 5 minutes isn't going to change anything, I snapped, the frustration I'd been bottling up spilling over. "You always do this. You leave everything to the last second and expect me to fix it." He sat up then, his expression darkening. "What's your problem? I said I'd get ready. Why are you always on my case?" "Because I'm tired, Liam," I shouted, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "I'm tired of doing everything while you just sit back and let me. I can't keep carrying this all on my own." The silence that followed was deafening. He didn't apologize, didn't even try to understand where I was coming from. Instead, he got up, grabbed his things, and walked out the door without a word. We went on the trip, but the tension between us never eased. It sat between us like a third person, a silent reminder of all the things we didn't say. And for the first time, I wondered if love was enough to bridge the growing chasm between us. It wasn't a single moment, Not one definitive revelation that shattered the fragile illusion. It was a series of little things, pieces of a puzzle that slowly, painfully, fell into place. At first, I dismissed them, clinging desperately to the belief that Liam was still the man I loved, still the man I thought I knew. But the cracks had grown too wide, the inconsistencies too glaring to ignore. The first sign came a few weeks after his accident. He had been home for a few days by then, settling into a routine that was equal parts frustrating and heartbreaking. I had taken a leave of absence from work to care for him, dedicating every waking moment to helping him rebuild his life, or the pieces of it he claimed to have lost. One morning, as I was cleaning the living room, I noticed his phone on the coffee table. It had been gathering dust since the accident, untouched and forgotten, or so I thought. On a whim, I picked it up, thinking I might go through his photos to jog his memory. But as soon as I pressed the home button, the screen lit up with notifications, messages, missed calls, all recent. My heart sank. Why hadn't he told me he was using his phone? When I confronted him, his reaction was immediate and defensive. "Oh, I just started using it again," he said, avoiding my gaze. I didn't think it was a big deal. "A big deal?" I repeated, my voice shaking. "Liam, you told me you didn't even remember the passcode. How did you—" "It came back to me," he interrupted, a little too quickly. "I don't know, it just happened." The explanation felt flimsy, but I let it slide. I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. But the nagging feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. Then there was the night I came home late after running errands. I had texted him earlier to let him know I'd be out, but when I walked through the door, I found him sitting on the couch, staring at his laptop. He didn't notice me at first, his face illuminated by the glow of the screen. As I moved closer, I saw what he was looking at, a news article about a local sports team. Not just reading it, he was commenting on it, referencing past games and players with a familiarity that stopped me cold. "Liam," I said, my voice cutting through the silence. He flinched, slamming the laptop shut as though he'd been caught doing something forbidden. "You scared me," he said, laughing nervously. "How was your day?" I ignored the question, my eyes narrowing. "Since when do you follow sports?" His smile faltered. "I don't know. I guess it's one of the things that stuck after the accident. Weird, huh?" Weird didn't even begin to cover it. I knew Liam. He had never been interested in sports, not even casually. And yet, here he was, rattling off stats and player histories like he'd been a lifelong fan. The inconsistencies piled up, one after another, until they were impossible to dismiss. The breaking point came one afternoon, when I returned from the store earlier than planned. As I opened the front door, I heard voices, Liam's and someone else's. Quietly, I crept closer, my heart pounding. He was on the phone, his tone light and casual, a far cry from the confused, subdued persona he'd shown me since the accident. "Yeah, she's still buying it," he said, laughing. "It's almost too easy. No, I haven't told her yet. Why would I? She's doing everything for me. Why mess with a good thing?" I felt the air leave my lungs, my body frozen in place as his words sank in. "She's still buying it." The phrase echoed in my mind, each repetition a hammer blow to my chest. He wasn't confused or lost. He wasn't struggling to piece his life back together. He was lying, manipulating me. And he didn't even sound guilty about it. When he hung up, I stepped into the room, my hands trembling. "Who were you talking to?" His head snapped up, his eyes widening in surprise. For a moment, he looked like a child caught with his hand in the cookie jar. But then he recovered, his expression hardening. "Just a friend," he said, too quickly. "Why?" "Don't lie to me," I said, my voice breaking. "I heard you, Liam. I heard everything." The silence that followed was deafening. He didn't deny it. He didn't try to explain or justify his actions. Instead, he just stared at me, his face unreadable. And that, more than anything, shattered what little hope I had left. "Why?" I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "Why would you do this to me?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It wasn't supposed to go this far," he said finally. "At first, it was just—" I don't know. I wanted a break, I guess. A way out of all the stress, the expectations, and then it just spiraled. A way out? I repeated, my voice rising. You pretended to lose your memory to avoid responsibility? Do you have any idea what you've put me through? What I've sacrificed for you? I didn't ask you to, he shot back, his tone defensive. You chose to. Don't pin that on me. His words were like a slap to the face. The man I had loved, the man I had built my life around, was gone. Or maybe he had never existed in the first place. Maybe I had been in love with an idea, a fantasy that had never been real. I turned and walked out of the room, out of the house, my mind racing. The truth was out now, and it was uglier than I could have ever imagined. He hadn't just lied to me. He had taken advantage of my love, my loyalty, and twisted them into something unrecognizable. And as much as it hurt, I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't keep living this lie. When the dust settled, I thought Liam might finally confront what he had done. I thought he would apologize, beg for forgiveness, maybe even try to explain himself. Instead, he became colder, more distant. He started spending more time out of the house, coming home late with vague excuses that barely masked his indifference. Every conversation ended in an argument or a hollow silence that echoed louder than any words. And then I found the bank statement. I hadn't intended to snoop, but something had felt off for weeks. Our joint account, the one we had been saving in for years, for the wedding, for our future, was suddenly lighter, much lighter. Tens of thousands of dollars were gone, siphoned away in steady, deliberate withdrawals. I stared at the paper in disbelief, my hands trembling as I tried to make sense of it. Liam, I said that evening, holding the statement out to him. What is this? He glanced at the paper and then back at me, his face impassive. It's my money too, he said flatly. I needed it. Needed it for what? My voice cracked, frustration and anger bubbling to the surface. We've been saving this for years, Liam. You can't just take it without telling me. Like I said, it's my money too, he repeated, his tone sharp. I don't need your permission. His words cut deep, but it was his lack of remorse that twisted the knife. He didn't care. He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. Something inside me snapped. What are you planning? I demanded, stepping closer. Don't lie to me, Liam. I know you're hiding something. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving me standing there with 1,000 questions and no answers. It was the following day when I found the email. He had left his laptop open, and the screen was glowing with a message sent to his mother. The subject line was simple, chilling, final steps. I hesitated for a moment, my heart racing, before clicking on it. Mom, I've got everything ready. The money's in the offshore account and the paperwork is done. I'll be out of here by the end of the week. Once I'm gone, she'll have nothing left. This will teach her not to mess with us. See you soon. My knees buckled, and I had to grab the edge of the table to steady myself. It wasn't just Liam, it was his mother too. They were working together to ruin me, to take everything we had built and leave me with nothing. The betrayal was staggering, but so was the clarity that followed. I couldn't let this happen. I wouldn't. I took the email as evidence and went straight to the police station. My hands were shaking as I recounted everything to the officer at the desk. Liam's lies, the stolen money, the plan to disappear. The officer listened patiently, but I could tell he was skeptical. It wasn't until a detective joined us, his sharp eyes taking in my every word, that I felt like someone was truly listening. Detective Harris introduced himself with a calm confidence that immediately put me at ease. He asked me to start from the beginning, to tell him everything, no matter how small. As I spoke, his expression shifted from curiosity to concern, and by the time I finished, he nodded firmly. We'll look into this, he said, but I need you to understand. It might take time. People like your fiancé are good at covering their tracks. Ex-fiancé, I corrected bitterly, and I don't care how long it takes. I just want to stop him. He offered me a small, reassuring smile. We'll do everything we can. Over the next few days, Detective Harris and I worked closely together. He was methodical, combing through the evidence I provided and digging deeper into Liam's financial records. What he uncovered made my blood run cold. Liam had been planning this for months, moving money into hidden accounts, fabricating documents to make it look like I had signed off on the withdrawals. His mother was listed as a beneficiary on everything. "He's setting you up," Harris explained during one of our meetings. "If this goes through, you'll be left with nothing. And worse, you could end up with legal trouble if he pins any of this on you." The thought was horrifying, but it also fueled my determination. I wasn't going to let them win. With Harris's help, we began building a case, collecting every piece of evidence we could find. Emails, bank statements, even the testimonies of friends who had noticed Liam's suspicious behavior. But Liam wasn't oblivious. He began to sense that something was wrong. He started watching me more closely, questioning my every move. I played the part of the oblivious, heartbroken fiancé, pretending I didn't know what he was planning. It was exhausting, living under the same roof as a man who was actively plotting my downfall. But I couldn't leave. Not yet. One night, as I sat on the couch, pretending to watch TV, Liam's phone buzzed on the coffee table. He had fallen asleep, and for once, his guard was down. I picked it up and unlocked it, scrolling through the messages until I found one from his mother. "Make sure everything's done by Friday. She won't see it coming." Friday, 2 days from now. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to stay calm. I took a screenshot of the message and sent it to myself before carefully putting the phone back where I found it. Liam stirred but didn't wake, and I slipped into the bathroom to call Detective Harris. "We have to move quickly," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "He's leaving in 2 days." "Understood," Harris replied. "I'll make sure we're ready." As I hung up, I caught my reflection in the mirror. My eyes were tired, my face pale and drawn, but there was a spark of resolve in my expression that hadn't been there before. Liam had underestimated me, but he wasn't going to get away with this. Not this time. After Liam's arrest, the house felt eerily quiet. The absence of his presence, his voice, his manipulative charm, left a strange void that I wasn't sure how to fill. For the first time in years, I was alone. Truly alone. The weight of it pressed down on me as I wandered from room to room, my thoughts spiraling in every direction. Detective Harris had been a steady anchor through it all, guiding me as we pieced together the evidence that ultimately led to Liam's downfall. He had been meticulous, patient, and more supportive than I could have ever expected. But now, with Liam behind bars and the initial adrenaline of the investigation fading, I was left with nothing but my own thoughts and the deep, gnawing pain of betrayal. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at a photograph of Liam and me from our early days. His arm was wrapped around me, his smile bright and genuine, or so I had thought. The woman in the photo looked happy, carefree, but now I could barely recognize her. I felt like a stranger in my own life, every memory tainted by the knowledge of what he had done. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything over and over in my mind. The lies, the manipulation, the cold, calculated way he had tried to destroy me. I had loved him. I had trusted him with my heart, my future, and he had turned it into a weapon against me. How had I been so blind? The following day, Detective Harris stopped by to check in. He brought coffee and a calm, reassuring presence that I desperately needed. "You're doing better than most people would in your situation," he said as we sat at the kitchen table. "It's not easy to face what you've been through and still keep moving forward." I shrugged, stirring my coffee absently. "I don't feel like I'm moving forward. I feel stuck, like I don't even know who I am anymore." "That's normal," he said gently. "But you're stronger than you think. You proved that when you stood up to him." There was something in his tone, something warm and sincere that made me look up. Our eyes met, and for a moment, the weight of everything didn't feel quite so crushing. I offered him a small, hesitant smile, and he returned it, the corners of his eyes crinkling in a way that made my heart skip a beat. We began spending more time together after that. At first, it was practical, discussing the case, reviewing evidence, preparing for the upcoming trial. But gradually, it became something more. He would stay a little longer after our meetings, sharing stories about his life and listening to mine. He had a way of making me laugh, even when I felt like I had nothing to smile about, and I found myself looking forward to his visits in a way I hadn't expected. It was subtle at first, a lingering glance, a brush of hands as he passed me a document. But soon, the unspoken connection between us became undeniable. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, he turned to me, his expression serious. "Mia," he began, his voice low, "I know this might not be the right time, but I care about you, more than I probably should, given the circumstances." My breath caught in my throat. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. But then I thought about everything he had done for me, the way he had been there when I felt like I had no one else. He had seen me at my worst and never wavered. "I care about you too," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. That night, for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel so alone. The next morning, as I was preparing breakfast, there was a knock at the door. I hesitated, a chill running down my spine. When I opened it, I found myself face to face with Liam's mother. She looked as polished and composed as ever, but her eyes burned with anger. Without waiting for an invitation, she pushed past me into the house. "This is your fault," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "You've ruined everything." I stepped back, my heart racing. "I didn't ruin anything. Liam did that all on his own." "Don't you dare!" she spat, her composure slipping. "Do you have any idea what you've done to my family? To me? You think you're so clever, don't you? But you won't win. I'll make sure of it." Her threats were sharp and relentless, each one cutting deeper than the last. She accused me of destroying her son's life, of being manipulative and vindictive, twisting the truth in ways that left me stunned. But as her tirade continued, I noticed something. She wasn't just angry, she was scared. And in her desperation, she said more than she realized. "You think you've got it all figured out," she sneered. "But you don't know half of it. Liam's smarter than you think. You'll see." Her words sent a chill through me, but before I could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "That's enough." Detective Harris stepped into the room, his expression calm but firm. I hadn't even noticed him come in, but he had heard everything. In his hand was his phone. The screen lit up as it recorded her every word. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her bravado faltering. "Ensuring Mia's safety," he replied coolly. "And now I have evidence to ensure the truth comes out, about you and your involvement." Her face paled, and for a moment she looked like she might say something more. But then she turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. Harris turned to me, his expression softening. "Are you okay?" I nodded, though my hands were still trembling. "I think so." "You don't have to face this alone," he said, his voice steady. "We'll get through this. Together." And for the first time, I believed him. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the trial reached its final day. Rows of spectators filled the benches, their whispers a quiet hum of curiosity and judgment. I sat at the plaintiff's table, my hands folded tightly in my lap. Detective Harris was beside me, his calm presence a steadying force as we waited for the verdict. Liam sat across the room, his once confident demeanor replaced by a sullen, resentful expression. His mother was nowhere to be seen, confined to her home under court order. The judge's gavel brought the room to silence. "The court has reviewed the evidence and the testimonies presented," he began, his deep voice echoing through the chamber. My heart pounded as I braced myself for his next words. "The defendant, Liam Harper, is found guilty of fraud, theft, and conspiracy." A wave of relief washed over me, tears springing to my eyes as the weight of months of fear and uncertainty lifted. The judge continued, outlining Liam's sentence: 10 years in prison with no possibility of parole for at least 5. The punishment was severe, but it felt just. This was the consequence of his betrayal, his manipulation, his cruelty. As the bailiff approached Liam to escort him out, he turned to me, his face twisted with anger. "This isn't over," he spat. "You'll regret this." I met his gaze, unflinching. "No, Liam, it's finally over." When the doors closed behind him, the room seemed to exhale collectively. Harris placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "You did it," he said softly. "It's over." The judge's voice broke through my thoughts. "As for Mrs. Harper," he said, referencing Liam's mother, "this court sentences her to 6 months of house arrest for her role in the conspiracy. Any violation of this sentence will result in further legal action." Hearing those words felt like the final piece falling into place. She wouldn't escape unscathed, not after everything she had done. That evening, Harris and I sat on my porch, a bottle of wine between us. The air was crisp and cool, the stars glittering above us as we toasted to a future free of Liam's shadow. "To justice," Harris said, raising his glass with a small smile. "To freedom," I replied, clinking my glass against his. The wine was warm and sweet, its taste mingling with the quiet satisfaction that filled the air. For the first time in months, I felt a lightness I had almost forgotten was possible. We talked about everything and nothing, life, dreams, the absurdity of what we had just survived. And as the night wore on, a thought began to take shape in my mind. "You know," I said, swirling the wine in my glass, "I think I need to get away for a while." Harris looked at me, his brow furrowed slightly. "Get away?" "Yeah," I said, my voice firming as the idea took hold. "All of this, the trial, the lies, the stress, it's been so much. I need a reset. Somewhere warm, with the sound of waves and the smell of salt in the air." He nodded slowly. "That sounds like a good idea. You deserve a break." I hesitated, my heart racing as I took the leap. "Come with me." His eyes widened slightly, surprise flickering across his face. "Mia, I mean it," I interrupted, my words rushing out before I could second-guess myself. "You've been there for me through all of this. You've done so much, more than I could ever repay, and I don't want to do this alone." For a moment he was silent, his expression unreadable. Then a slow smile spread across his face. "Okay," he said simply. "Let's go." A laugh bubbled out of me, a sound I hadn't heard from myself in far too long. "Really?" "Really," he said, his smile widening. "I could use a break too, and the thought of the ocean sounds pretty damn good right now." We spent the rest of the evening planning our getaway, imagining sun-soaked beaches and lazy days spent with nothing but each other and the sea. For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to hope, to believe that maybe, just maybe, life was finally moving in the right direction. As the night stretched on and the wine bottle emptied, I felt a warmth settle over me, not just from the alcohol, but from the realization that I wasn't alone. Liam had tried to take everything from me, but in the end, I had found something stronger, myself, and someone who believed in me. We clinked our glasses one last time before heading inside, leaving the shadows of the past behind us. The sunlight streamed through the wide windows of our new home, casting golden patterns across the hardwood floors. The soft hum of life filled the space, the gentle clatter of breakfast dishes in the sink, the distant chirping of birds outside. It was peaceful, a kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. This was our fresh start, a new chapter free from the shadows of betrayal and heartbreak. The house wasn't grand, but it was ours. Nestled on the edge of a quiet seaside town, it had everything I had dreamed of. A small garden in the back, a cozy porch where we could watch the sunset, and the sound of waves rolling in the distance. Harris and I had spent weeks making it our own, unpacking boxes, choosing paint colors, and laughing over the ridiculous things we uncovered in the process. It felt like building a life from the ground up, one small step at a time. "Mia!" Harris called from the kitchen, his voice warm and familiar. "Do you want tea or coffee?" "Tea," I replied, smiling as I leaned against the doorway. He turned, holding 2 mugs, his face lighting up when he saw me. There was something about the way he looked at me, like I was the only person in the world who mattered. It still caught me off guard sometimes, how lucky I felt to have found him amidst the chaos of my life. We sat together at the kitchen table, the morning light painting his features in soft hues. We talked about everything and nothing, the new neighbors who had brought over a pie the day before, the restaurant down the street we wanted to try, the shelves we still needed to put up in the study. It was simple, ordinary, but it felt like magic. Later that afternoon, as I was unpacking the last of the boxes in our bedroom, a wave of dizziness hit me. I steadied myself against the dresser, my heart pounding. It wasn't the first time it had happened recently, and I had brushed it off as stress or exhaustion from the move. But this time, it felt different. A quiet suspicion began to form in my mind, one that I couldn't ignore. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands trembling slightly as I reached for my phone. A quick search confirmed what I was beginning to suspect. The symptoms, the nausea, the dizziness, the fatigue, they all pointed to one thing. Heart racing, I grabbed my keys and slipped out of the house, making my way to the nearest pharmacy. The short drive felt like an eternity, and by the time I returned, the small bag in my hand felt heavier than it should have. Harris was still in the living room, oblivious to my inner turmoil as he tinkered with the TV settings. I locked myself in the bathroom, staring at the test in my hands. The instructions were simple enough, but my hands shook as I followed them. A few minutes later, the result appeared. 2 lines. Positive. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The reality of it hit me like a tidal wave, overwhelming and beautiful all at once. I was pregnant. After everything I had been through, this tiny, fragile life growing inside me felt like a miracle. When I stepped out of the bathroom, Harris looked up, his brow furrowing at my expression. "Mia, what's wrong?" I walked toward him, holding the test in my hand. "I need to tell you something." His eyes dropped to the test, and for a moment he just stared. Then his face broke into the most radiant smile I had ever seen. We're having a baby?" I nodded, tears streaming down my face as he pulled me into his arms. "We're having a baby." We stood there for what felt like forever, holding each other as the reality of our new life sank in. The house, the garden, the quiet mornings, they were all part of the foundation we were building. But this tiny life, was the future we hadn't even dared to dream of. The months that followed were filled with preparations and excitement. We painted the spare room a soft shade of yellow, filled it with furniture, and debated baby names late into the night. Harris was by my side every step of the way, his steady presence a constant source of comfort and joy. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, he took my hand in his. "You know," he said softly, "I never thought I'd get to have this. A home, a family, a future. But you've given me all of it." I looked at him, my heart full to bursting. "And you've given me something I thought I'd lost forever. Hope." The sound of the waves filled the silence between us, a gentle reminder of the life we were creating together. In that moment, I knew we were exactly where we were meant to be, standing at the edge of a new beginning, with nothing but love and possibility ahead of us.